They say he died at 21, but if you believe that, you ain't been paying attention. His name was Henry McCarty, went by William H. Bonney, but the world remembers him as Billy the Kid. Born likely November 23, 1859, in the slums of New York City, a skinny Irish-American boy raised by a single mother who died of tuberculosis when he was 14, leaving him orphaned and tossed to the wind like desert dust. Morning breaks over Silver City, New Mexico Territory, 1873. Adobe buildings catch early light. Dust motes dance in doorways where merchants sweep yesterday's grime into gutters that lead nowhere. Across the settlement, families make their livings, fathers checking livestock one last time, mothers hanging laundry on lines that sag with desert heat, children collecting bottle caps they think are treasures. In that narrow space between survival and surrender, you stand with everything you own fitting in your pockets, listening to the first sounds of another day when being 14 and alone means learning to become invisible. This is not a story of gunfights or glory. It's the slow work of putting one breath after another when breathing becomes the only choice available, food scrounged, boots worn through, dignity discarded when hunger becomes louder than pride, and hope measured in hours rather than years. Welcome to American Sleepless Story, where forgotten moments from America's past become tonight's gentle companion. These are quiet stories told slowly, perfect for when your mind needs to wander somewhere peaceful. If you'd like more stories like this, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it where you are. I love knowing this community spans different places and time zones, all finding rest in the same American stories. Now, settle in, here comes the story. Picture yourself walking through the dusty streets of Silver City, New Mexico Territory in 1873. The air tastes of alkali dust and desperation, where wooden shacks lean against each other like drunken men sharing secrets. This was Henry McCarty's world at 14, newly orphaned and cast into a landscape that had no patience for weakness, no safety net for the forgotten. The morning sun carved harsh shadows between buildings that looked ready to collapse at the first strong wind. Silver City wasn't much more than a collection of hastily built structures surrounding a few legitimate businesses and twice as many saloons. The smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and wood smoke hung in the air like a permanent fog. For a skinny Irish boy with no family, no money, and hands too soft for real work, survival meant learning to become invisible while simultaneously making yourself useful enough that someone might toss you a coin or a crust of bread. Catherine McCarty had tried to give her son something resembling stability, moving from boarding house to boarding house, taking in laundry and mending when her tuberculosis allowed. But consumption was a patient killer in those days, stealing breath by breath until there was nothing left but a rattle in the chest and a boy standing alone beside a fresh grave. The ladies of Silver City might have clucked sympathetically, but sympathy doesn't put food in empty bellies or provide shelter when the desert nights turn cold enough to freeze water in tin cups. At 14, Henry learned that American Sleepless Story began long before electric lights and racing thoughts. It started with the simple terror of not knowing where your next meal would come from, or whether you'd have a roof when the winter rains turned the streets into rivers of mud. The boarding houses were full of transients who paid by the week, men with calloused hands and empty pockets who looked right through skinny boys with no prospects. Sleep became a luxury when every night brought the possibility of waking up hungry. By 15, Henry was arrested for stealing clothes, a crime that sounds almost quaint today when you can order anything online and have it delivered to your door. But imagine being so desperate that you'd risk jail time just to have clean clothes that fit, garments that might help you look respectable enough to find work. The sheriff who locked him up probably saw dozens of boys just like him, orphans who'd aged out of childhood too quickly and found themselves competing with grown men for jobs that barely paid enough to survive. The funny thing about being young and desperate is how quickly you learn to read people, to spot the difference between someone who might help and someone who'd rather step over your body than acknowledge your existence. Henry developed that keen awareness that comes from living on the margins, where a wrong word or a misread situation could mean the difference between eating and going hungry for another day. This wasn't the romantic notion of Western independence that movies would later sell. This was grinding, daily survival that aged boys into men before their voices changed. Working odd jobs around Silver City meant competing with men twice your size and half your education, but none of that mattered when employers needed backs strong enough to haul freight or hands steady enough to muck out stables. The boring story of frontier survival was mostly about endurance, showing up every day even when your stomach cramped from hunger, even when your boots had holes that let in every pebble and puddle. Most days nothing dramatic happened, just the slow wearing away of youth under the weight of necessity. The older residents of Silver City watched boys like Henry with a mixture of pity and wariness, knowing that desperation could turn honest children into thieves, that hunger could drive the gentlest souls to violence. They'd seen it before, the gradual hardening that happened when society offered no legitimate path forward, when being good and honest meant staying poor and invisible. Some of these men had probably started as orphans themselves, and they recognized the look in Henry's eyes that said he was calculating odds, weighing options, preparing for whatever came next. American sleep might have been easier in towns where families took in strays and communities looked after their own. But Silver City was a mining town where everyone was looking for their own break, their own chance to strike it rich and leave this dusty collection of dreams behind. The churches tried to help when they could, but charity has limits when everyone's struggling, when even the well-meaning folks are just one bad month away from their own disasters. What nobody talks about in those romanticized tales of the Old West is how mind-numbingly boring poverty actually was. How many hours you spent just sitting and waiting for opportunities that rarely came. How you learned to make a single meal last an entire day just to stretch your meager resources. Henry spent countless afternoons watching better-dressed men conduct business he couldn't afford to be part of, learning lessons about power and money that no schoolbook could teach, understanding that in America, being poor wasn't just about lacking money. John Tunstall arrived in Lincoln County like a breath of fresh air in a room that had been closed up too long. The young Englishman carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from education and family money. But more importantly, he possessed something rare in that corner of New Mexico territory, genuine idealism about what America could become. His store sat at one end of Lincoln's main street like a challenge to the established order, its shelves stocked with quality goods sold at fair prices, a stark contrast to the monopoly that had strangled the county for years. The Murphy-Dolan faction controlled Lincoln County the way a spider controls its web, with invisible threads connecting every source of power and profit. They owned the general store, the bank, the contracts to supply military posts, and most crucially, they owned Sheriff William Brady's loyalty. When Tunstall opened his competing store and started offering credit to small ranchers, he wasn't just selling goods. He was declaring war on a system that had kept an entire county under the thumb of a few powerful men. The established merchants watched this English upstart with growing irritation, like homeowners discovering someone had built a fence that blocked their view. Henry McCarty, now calling himself William Bonney, found steady work at Tunstall's ranch, where the Englishman treated his employees with a respect that was foreign to most frontier employers. For the first time since his mother's death, Billy experienced what it felt like to have someone believe in his potential, to see past his rough edges and criminal record to the intelligent, loyal young man underneath. Tunstall paid fair wages, provided decent food and shelter, and perhaps most importantly, he listened when Billy talked about his ideas for improving ranch operations. The lazy afternoons at Tunstall's ranch held a peculiar kind of peace that would soon seem like a dream. Billy would spend hours mending fences under the endless New Mexico sky, the repetitive work leaving his mind free to wander while his hands stayed busy. The sound of cattle lowing in distant pastures, the whisper of wind through prairie grass, the satisfying thunk of hammer against fence posts, these became the soundtrack of the most stable period in Billy's short life. Even the most boring story of ranch work carried a rhythm that felt like home. When Tunstall rode out that February morning in 1878, he probably thought about the meeting he was heading to, maybe rehearsed the arguments he'd make to other small ranchers about standing up to the Murphy faction. The ambush came swift and brutal, the kind of violence that frontier justice delivered to those who challenged the wrong people. Billy wasn't there when it happened, but he arrived soon enough to see Tunstall's body sprawled in the dust, his employer's dream of fair dealing dying with him under the pitiless desert sun. The formation of the regulators began as something legitimate, a legally appointed posse with actual warrants to arrest Tunstall's killers. Billy and the other men wore badges and carried papers that gave them the authority of law, at least on paper. But grief has a way of clouding judgment, and the line between justice and vengeance blurs when you're staring at the body of the only man who'd ever shown you kindness. The American sleepless nights that followed were filled with plans that grew darker as the men realized how deep the corruption ran. Sheriff William Brady represented everything wrong with Lincoln County's power structure, a man who wore the badge but served private interests rather than public justice. When the regulators gunned him down in broad daylight on Lincoln's Main Street, they crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The shooting itself was over in seconds, but the consequences would echo for years. Billy later said it felt like watching someone else pull the trigger, as if the violence had been inevitable from the moment Tunstall's blood soaked into New Mexico soil. The 5-day Battle of Lincoln turned the town into something from a nightmare, with bullets flying between buildings where families had tried to build normal lives. Women kept their children inside while men took positions behind whatever cover they could find, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the dust and heat until the air itself seemed poisonous. The battle raged with the boring story of siege warfare, long stretches of waiting punctuated by sudden bursts of violence, men checking their ammunition and wondering if they'd live to see another sunrise. By the time federal troops arrived to restore order, the damage was done. The Murphy faction had won through superior firepower and political connections, leaving the regulators branded as outlaws and Billy tagged with a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his days. The idealistic young man who'd wanted to see justice done for his murdered employer was now marked for death himself, hunted by the same legal system that had failed to protect Tunstall in the first place. What struck Billy most during those final days of the Lincoln County War, not the violence or the chaos, but the profound sense of betrayal that settled over everything like fine dust. He'd believed, perhaps for the first time in his life, that there might be a place for honest dealing in the world, that good men could stand up to corruption and win. Instead, he learned that in America, power belongs to those willing to use it most ruthlessly, and that sometimes the only choice left to decent people is between dying on their knees or fighting back with whatever weapons they can find. Governor Lew Wallace arrived in New Mexico territory carrying the weight of literary fame and political ambition, a man who'd written one of the most popular novels in America while serving as a Civil War general. Ben-Hur had made him wealthy and respected, but Lincoln County presented a different kind of challenge than managing fictional chariots or commanding Union troops. The violence had spiraled beyond anyone's control, and Washington needed someone with enough gravitas to restore order without making martyrs of the wrong people. Billy had grown tired of running, tired of looking over his shoulder every time he entered a town or stopped at a water hole. The life of an outlaw wasn't the romantic adventure that dime novels would later portray. It was a grinding existence of poor food, uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, and a constant awareness that today might be your last. When word reached him that the new governor was offering amnesty to those willing to testify about the Lincoln County troubles, it felt like the first genuine opportunity he'd had in months to reclaim something resembling a normal life. The meeting between Billy and Governor Wallace took place in a small room that smelled of dust and old paper, where two men from vastly different worlds tried to find common ground. Wallace saw an intelligent young man whose articulate speech and obvious education set him apart from the usual frontier desperados, while Billy saw perhaps his only chance to escape the cycle of violence that had consumed his life since Tunstall's death. The governor's proposition was straightforward: testify truthfully about what you witnessed and receive a full pardon for past crimes. Billy held up his end of the bargain with the kind of detailed testimony that could only come from someone who'd been present when history was being written in blood and gunpowder. He named names, described events, provided the kind of insider information that prosecutors dream of getting from key witnesses. His memory for details impressed the court officials, who found themselves listening to accounts of corruption and violence that painted a clear picture of how completely the Murphy faction had subverted legal authority in Lincoln County. The weeks of testimony felt almost boring story after story of routine corruption, each incident building on the last until the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Billy would spend hours in stuffy courtrooms, recounting events with the precision of someone who'd learned to notice everything because his life depended on accurate observations. The American sleepless nights during this period were filled with hope rather than fear, as he began to imagine what life might look like with a clean slate and a chance to start over somewhere new. But Governor Wallace discovered what many politicians learned too late, that promising justice and delivering it are two entirely different things. The same powerful interests that had controlled Lincoln County before the war still wielded influence after it, and they had no intention of allowing their enemies to walk free just because a governor had made promises. Pressure came from Washington, from territorial officials, from business interests who preferred the current arrangement of profitable chaos to any system that might hold them accountable for their actions. The betrayal came not with dramatic confrontation, but with bureaucratic delay, the kind of administrative stonewalling that kills hope more effectively than bullets. Billy's pardon was postponed, then reconsidered, then buried under layers of legal technicalities that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Wallace, for all his literary skill and military experience, found himself outmaneuvered by men who understood territorial politics better than he understood the characters in his novels. By the time Billy realized he'd been abandoned by the very system that had promised him salvation, winter was settling over New Mexico territory with the kind of cold that makes you grateful for any shelter, even if it's a hideout in the mountains rather than a proper home. The governor's promises had evaporated like morning mist, leaving Billy exactly where he'd started, branded as an outlaw, hunted by men who wore badges but served private interests, trapped in a territory that had no place for someone who'd seen too much and testified honestly. The final insult came when Wallace left New Mexico territory to take up a diplomatic post in Turkey, effectively washing his hands of the entire Lincoln County mess and the young man whose trust he'd earned and then discarded. Billy watched the governor's departure with the kind of bitter understanding that comes from learning that even well-intentioned authority figures will sacrifice inconvenient allies when political pressure becomes too intense. The lesson was clear. In America, promises from powerful men are only as good as their continued convenience. What bothered Billy most wasn't the danger or the renewed manhunt, but the realization that he'd allowed himself to hope for something better, to believe that the system might actually work the way it was supposed to work. The boring story of his attempted redemption became another chapter in the longer narrative of frontier justice, where right and wrong mattered less than who had more guns and better political connections. He'd gambled his safety on the word of a man who wrote about honor and courage, only to discover that real life rarely follows the moral clarity of popular fiction. Pat Garrett had once been the kind of friend you could count on for a drink and a laugh, back when Lincoln County's troubles seemed like someone else's problem, and both men were just trying to make their way in a territory that promised more than it delivered. They'd shared whiskey and stories in saloons from Fort Sumner to Roswell, two young men with similar backgrounds who understood what it meant to drift from place to place looking for opportunity. But friendship has a way of becoming expendable when political ambition and public pressure collide, and by 1880, Pat Garrett was wearing a sheriff's badge and Billy, the kid, had become his most wanted quarry. The transformation of friendship into pursuit carried its own peculiar sadness, like watching someone you'd trusted become a stranger wearing a familiar face. Garrett understood Billy's habits, his preferred hideouts, the network of sympathizers who provided food and shelter when the law got too close. This intimate knowledge made him the perfect hunter, but it also meant that every step of the chase felt like a betrayal of shared history. The boring story of their relationship had become something darker, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out across the high desert of southeastern New Mexico. Fort Sumner sat like a forgotten outpost at the edge of nowhere, a collection of adobe buildings that had once housed Navajo prisoners but now served as an informal sanctuary for those who preferred to avoid official attention. Billy had friends there, people who remembered his kindness and his easy laugh, who saw past the wanted posters to the young man who'd help with chores and never caused trouble when he visited. The town existed in that gray area between law and lawlessness that characterized much of the frontier, where a man's reputation mattered more than what papers might be posted about him. Pete Maxwell's bedroom was the kind of place where important men conducted quiet business, a room that smelled of tobacco and leather where deals were made and secrets shared. The adobe walls held the coolness of desert nights even when the days grew scorching, and the thick wooden door muffled conversations that weren't meant for outside ears. On the night of July 14, 1881, those walls would witness whatever actually happened between Pat Garrett and the man he claimed was Billy the Kid, an encounter that would be debated for decades to come. Garrett's official account read like something from a dime novel, the dramatic confrontation in the dark, the quick draw, the famous outlaw dying with a gun in his hand. But the people of Fort Sumner told different stories, whispered accounts that didn't match the sheriff's neat narrative. Some said they never heard a second gun fire. Others claimed the body didn't look right, and more than a few suggested that Garrett had been drinking heavily that night and might not have seen clearly what he thought he saw in the darkness. The hasty burial before dawn struck many observers as suspicious, the kind of quick disposal that suggested someone wanted to avoid close examination of the evidence. In an era when photographers were becoming common and people understood the value of documentation, the lack of any verified images of Billy's corpse raised questions that Garrett never adequately answered. The American sleepless nights that followed were filled with speculation and doubt, as residents of Fort Sumner wondered what they'd actually witnessed and why the official story felt so incomplete. What made the whole affair even stranger was Garrett's subsequent behavior, his reluctance to discuss details and his obvious discomfort whenever anyone pressed him about specifics. For a man who just killed the most famous outlaw in New Mexico territory, he seemed remarkably unhappy about his achievement. Some attributed this to the natural melancholy that comes from killing an old friend, but others wondered if Pat Garrett was carrying a secret that weighed more heavily than simple regret. The legend that emerged from that night in Fort Sumner served everyone's interests, except perhaps the truth. Politicians could claim that law and order had been restored. Newspapers could sell papers with dramatic accounts of frontier justice, and Hollywood would eventually turn the whole story into entertainment that bore little resemblance to actual events. But legends have a way of obscuring facts, and the more famous the Billy the Kid story became, the harder it became to separate what really happened from what people wanted to believe had happened. Years later, when Garrett wrote his own account of the killing, the book felt like the work of a man trying to convince himself as much as his readers, filled with unnecessary details and defensive explanations that raised more questions than they answered. The boring story of that night in Fort Sumner had been transformed into frontier mythology, but the people who were there never quite accepted the official version of events, and their whispered doubts would eventually find their way to a courtroom in Texas where an old man would claim that Pat Garrett had missed his target in the dark. What struck those who knew both men was how quickly Garrett aged after that night, as if carrying the weight of whatever had really happened in Pete Maxwell's bedroom was slowly grinding him down. The sheriff, who'd been ambitious and confident before July 14th, became increasingly withdrawn and defensive, a man who seemed to be constantly looking over his shoulder for something that might catch up with him. Perhaps he was simply mourning the loss of a friend, or perhaps he knew that some secrets are too heavy for one man to carry alone. Nearly 70 years had passed since that summer night in Fort Sumner when an old man named Brushy Bill Roberts walked into the governor's office in Austin, Texas, carrying a secret that had aged with him through decades of silence. Hamilton County had been his home for most of those years, where he'd lived the quiet life of a rancher who kept to himself and never talked much about his past. His neighbors knew him as a man who understood horses and cattle, who could read weather patterns like scripture, and who possessed an unusual knowledge of New Mexico geography for someone who claimed to be a lifelong Texan. Brushy Bill's appearance told the story of hard living withered by time, his face carved by wind and sun into the kind of landscape that frontier life etched on men who'd survived longer than most. His hands bore the calluses of honest work, but also scars that suggested a more violent past, including a distinctive mark on his left thigh that he claimed came from a gunshot wound received in Arizona Territory decades earlier. When he spoke, it was with the deliberate cadence of someone who'd learned to choose words carefully, as if every sentence carried weight that others might not understand. The story Brushy told Governor Thomas Mabry sounded impossible at first, the kind of tall tale that old men sometimes spin when they want attention or sympathy. He claimed to be Henry McCarty, known to history as Billy the Kid, and he wanted nothing more than the pardon that Governor Lew Wallace had promised him back in 1879. He didn't want money, didn't want fame, didn't want anything except the legal recognition that he'd served his time in hiding and deserved the peace that comes with official forgiveness. The boring story he told was simply that of a man who'd grown tired of carrying someone else's death on his shoulders. What made Brushy's claims compelling wasn't the dramatic elements, but the mundane details he could recite with the precision of lived experience. He described the interior of Lincoln's courthouse with the accuracy of someone who'd spent time there as a prisoner, noting where the rifles were stored, how the wooden stairs curved, and even the specific words James Bell had spoken before dying. He could draw maps of Tunstall's ranch from memory, including fence lines, water sources, and the location of every building, details that weren't recorded in any public documents but would have been burned into the memory of someone who'd worked there. The forensic evidence that emerged during Brushy's brief moment in the spotlight painted a picture that was hard to dismiss as coincidence. Photographic analysis showed a 93% facial match between the old rancher and the only verified image of Billy the Kid, measurements that accounted for the natural aging process over 7 decades. The scars on his body corresponded to documented wounds Billy had received, including gunshot damage and powder burns that matched contemporary accounts of the courthouse escape and other violent encounters. Handwriting experts who examined samples of Brushy's correspondence found striking similarities to letters attributed to Billy the Kid, not just in the formation of individual letters, but in more subtle characteristics like pressure, slant, and grammatical peculiarities that are almost impossible to fake convincingly. The way he held a pen, the rhythm of his writing, even his tendency to use specific phrases all aligned with documents from the 1880s that historians had authenticated as genuine examples of Billy's correspondence. More than a dozen surviving witnesses from the Lincoln County days examined Brushy during his brief time in the public eye, and their reactions ranged from stunned recognition to emotional reunions with someone they'd thought was dead for 70 years. These weren't people looking for attention or trying to perpetuate a hoax. They were elderly residents of New Mexico who had no reason to lie about recognizing a man they'd known as young people. Their testimonies were consistent and detailed, describing mannerisms and memories that would have been impossible for an imposter to replicate. The American sleepless nights that Brushy experienced during his final weeks were probably filled with regret about coming forward, as he found himself subjected to the kind of media circus that turns genuine human stories into entertainment for people who'd never lived through the experiences they were judging. Reporters treated him like a sideshow attraction, photographers blinded him with flashbulbs, and skeptics dismissed his claims without bothering to examine the evidence he'd brought to support them. Governor Mabry's rejection of Brushy's pardon request felt like the final betrayal in a life that had known to many disappointments, the last confirmation that official America would rather preserve its comfortable legends than confront uncomfortable truths. The old man returned to Hamilton County a broken figure, his health failing under the stress of public scrutiny and official rejection. Within a month, his heart gave out, as if the effort of carrying his secret into the open had finally exhausted his body's ability to continue. The boring story of Brushy Bill Roberts ended with a funeral attended by neighbors who'd known him as a quiet rancher rather than a famous outlaw, people who mourned the loss of someone who'd been a decent man regardless of what name he'd used or what past he'd carried. His grave marker bore the name he'd lived under for decades, not the one that history remembered, and the secret he'd tried to share died with him, leaving behind only questions that no DNA test was ever allowed to answer. And so, we reach the end of another American sleepless story, where the most dramatic revelation turns out to be that maybe, just maybe, the most famous death in the Old West never actually happened at all. Henry McCarty's journey from New York orphan to frontier legend to forgotten Texas rancher reminds us that history isn't always written by the winners. Sometimes it's written by the people who need the story to end a certain way. Regardless of what really happened in Pete Maxwell's dark bedroom that July night, what strikes me most about Billy's story is the gunfights or the dramatic escapes, but the profound loneliness that runs through it like a thread connecting each chapter of his life. From that 14-year-old boy standing beside his mother's grave in Silver City to the old man dying of heartbreak in Hamilton County, this was fundamentally the story of someone looking for a place to belong, for people who would see past the wanted posters to the human being underneath. In our connected age of social media and instant communication, there's something almost unimaginable about that level of isolation, that complete disconnection from anything resembling home. The boring story of Brushy Bill Roberts spending decades as a quiet rancher, keeping his secret while the world moved on without him, offers its own kind of comfort in these restless times. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is simply disappear, to let the world think you're dead while you go about the patient work of learning to live with yourself. There's a peace in anonymity that our celebrity-obsessed culture has forgotten, a relief in being nobody special that might be worth more than all the fame in the world. Tonight, as you settle into your comfortable bed with your doors locked and your worries confined to things like mortgage payments and traffic jams, take a moment to appreciate how far we've traveled from Henry McCarty's world of constant danger and grinding poverty. Your ancestors would consider your daily routine a paradise of safety and abundance, your biggest problems the kind of luxuries that frontier orphans couldn't even imagine having the privilege to worrying about. But perhaps the most important lesson from Billy's story is about the stories we tell ourselves and others, the way legends become more powerful than facts, and how sometimes the truth gets buried under layers of convenient fiction. In our age of viral misinformation and competing narratives, there's something both comforting and disturbing about discovering that even our most carefully documented history might not be quite what it seems. So, sweet dreams, fellow insomniacs. May your sleep be deeper than Billy ever managed during those 100 years, and may your morning bring the kind of ordinary peace that Henry McCarty spent his entire life searching for and maybe, just maybe, finally found in the quiet pastures of Hamilton County, Texas, If you're still awake and found some comfort in tonight's wandering through America's dusty past, I'd love to know what other forgotten stories call to you. What decade draws your restless mind? The Depression-era boarding houses, the wartime home front, the early days of television when families gathered around glowing screens like campfires? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if these sleepless stories help quiet your mind, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell, not for drama or excitement, but for more gentle journeys into the beautiful boredom of bygone days. Because sometimes the best stories are the ones that don't really go anywhere. They just help us fall asleep knowing that even our restless nights connect us to generations of Americans who lay awake wondering what tomorrow might bring, and whether they'd be strong enough to meet it. Sleep well, and remember, in the grand American sleepless story, we're all just trying to find our way home.